Look up at the night sky. The moon is so incredibly familiar, so seemingly constant that we rarely give it a second thought. It is the celestial body that dictates the rhythm of our oceans, stabilizes our planet's axial tilt, and has inspired humanity's greatest myths, religions, and scientific achievements. But what if everything we have been taught about our closest cosmic neighbor is fundamentally, terrifyingly wrong? What if the moon is not a natural satellite at all? Deep within the climate-controlled archives of the British Museum and the Louvre lie ancient clay tablets meticulously carved by the Sumerians, the absolute earliest known complex civilization in human history. These texts, written in wedge-shaped cuneiform thousands of years before the Old Testament, contain descriptions of the cosmos that modern astronomy is only just beginning to verify. But hidden within these ancient records is a claim so staggering, so completely at odds with established modern science, that mainstream scholars have aggressively dismissed it as pure religious mythology for centuries. The ancient Sumerians did not just worship the moon as a glowing rock in the sky. They explicitly claimed it was a hollowed-out vessel. They described it as a colossal artificial transport ship brought into our solar system by their gods. Today, we are going to completely deconstruct the ancient texts of Mesopotamia, cross-reference their bizarre claims with declassified NASA seismic data from the Apollo lunar missions, and deeply explore one of the most controversial, suppressed scientific hypotheses of the 20th century. We are going to investigate whether the moon is a natural geological formation or the ultimate ancient artifact. To understand this terrifying possibility, we first have to understand the people who originally documented it. The Sumerian civilization exploded onto the historical record around 4500 BCE in the fertile valleys between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in what is now modern-day Iraq. Their sudden appearance deeply frustrates modern historians. They didn't slowly evolve from hunter-gatherers into city builders. They seemingly emerged overnight, already possessing highly advanced knowledge of agriculture, complex mathematics, deep-vein metallurgy, and most inexplicably, advanced astronomy. They accurately mapped the solar system, perfectly documented the planetary orbits, and understood the concept of axial precession thousands of years before the invention of the telescope. When you read their own historical accounts, the Sumerians did not claim they developed this knowledge themselves. They violently insisted it was handed down to them by a group of beings they called the Anunnaki, a term that directly translates to those who from heaven to earth came. In the Sumerian cosmological texts, particularly the sprawling epic known as the Enuma Elish, the moon is not treated as a natural consequence of planetary accretion. The deity associated with the moon was named Nana, or Sin. But the Sumerian descriptions of Nana are incredibly mechanical. They repeatedly describe the moon not as a sphere of rock, but as a chariot, a boat of the sky, and a massive vessel that was physically navigated through the heavens. The cuneiform texts describe this celestial boat as having an interior, a massive hollow space where the gods could reside and from which they directed their operations on Earth. For generations, linguists and anthropologists have written this off as standard ancient poetry. A primitive people seeing a glowing orb in the sky and comparing it to a glowing boat sailing on a cosmic ocean. It is a safe, rational explanation. But that safe explanation begins to violently fracture when you realize the Sumerians perfectly documented the physical consequences of this vessel arriving in Earth's orbit. If a massive planetary body the exact size of our moon suddenly entered Earth's orbit from deep space, the immediate physical consequences for our planet would be absolutely apocalyptic. The sudden, massive introduction of extreme gravitational pull would instantly rip across the Earth's surface. It would cause massive tectonic fracturing, triggering global earthquakes, hypervolcanism, and most significantly, a devastating, instantaneous displacement of the world's oceans. A tidal wave miles high would sweep across the continents, wiping out almost all terrestrial life. Interestingly, the absolute most famous story in all of Sumerian mythology, a story that predates the biblical account of Noah by millennia, is the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Great Flood. The Sumerians documented a global deluge that wiped out humanity, an event triggered by the gods in the heavens. For a long time, researchers treated the arrival of the moon vessel and the Great Flood as two separate mythological events. But modern rogue astrophysicists have pointed out that if the Sumerian texts are read literally as historical records, the arrival of the artificial moon and the global flood are actually the exact same event. The flood was the devastating, unavoidable gravitational consequence of parking a massive artificial satellite right next to a water-bearing planet. This concept sounds like pure science fiction. The idea that the moon is hollow is universally ridiculed by modern academia. But the shocking truth is that the hollow moon hypothesis did not originate with ancient aliens theorists or internet conspiracy forums. It originated with highly respected, top-tier aerospace scientists. And it is backed up by some of the most baffling, unexplained data ever collected by NASA. On November 20th, 1969, the Apollo 12 mission was in full swing. Astronauts Pete Conrad and Alan Bean had successfully completed their lunar surface operations and had returned to the command module orbiting high above. Before heading back to Earth, they performed a highly specific, planned maneuver. They intentionally decoupled the heavy ascent stage of their lunar module and sent it violently crashing back down onto the surface of the moon. This was not space littering. It was a calibrated seismic experiment. The astronauts had left highly sensitive seismometers deeply embedded in the lunar dust. NASA scientists at the Mission Control Center in Houston wanted to measure the seismic shock waves of a known impact to learn about the moon's internal structure. When the module smashed into the moon with the force of 1 ton of TNT, the seismic equipment immediately lit up. But the data that streamed back to Earth left the geologists staring at their monitors in absolute, stunning disbelief. The moon didn't react like a solid ball of rock. It reacted like a massive, hollow bell. The seismic vibrations from the relatively small impact did not dampen and fade away quickly like they do on Earth. Instead, the shock waves built up, hit a massive peak, and then continuously reverberated for nearly an hour. The director of the seismic experiment, Dr. Geo Morris Ewing, publicly stated to the press, "As for the meaning of it, I'd rather not make an interpretation right now. But it is as though someone had struck a bell, say, in the belfry of a church, a single blow, and found that the reverberation from it continued for 55 minutes. NASA assumed it must be a fluke, an anomaly caused by a strange, localized geological formation. But they tested it again. Months later, during the infamous, ill-fated Apollo 13 mission, the massive third stage of the Saturn V rocket, the S-4B, was intentionally directed to impact the lunar surface. This was a much heavier object, striking the moon with an explosive force equivalent to over 11 tons of TNT. The resulting seismic data was even more terrifying. The moon rang like a gong for over 3 hours. The seismic waves traveled to an estimated depth of 25 miles and then appeared to dramatically bounce off something incredibly hard, completely changing direction and speed. On Earth, when an earthquake hits, seismic P waves and S waves travel through the solid crust and the liquid mantle, losing energy and naturally dampening out. The only physical way a massive sphere can vibrate continuously for 3 hours from a surface impact is if the outer crust is incredibly dense and the interior is massively, overwhelmingly hollow. The Apollo seismic data sent shockwaves, pun intended, through the global scientific community. While American scientists scrambled to find complex, natural explanations involving fractured breccia and lack of moisture, Scientists on the other side of the Iron Curtain took a much darker, much more radical approach. In July of 1970, two highly decorated senior scientists from the elite Soviet Academy of Sciences, Mikhail Vasin and Alexander Sherbakov, published a massive, intensely detailed paper in the prestigious Soviet journal Sputnik. The paper was titled, "Is the Moon the Creation of Alien Intelligence?" Vasin and Sherbakov were not fringe crackpots. They were leading astrophysicists employed by the Soviet space program. Their paper completely abandoned the natural satellite theory and forcefully argued the exact same thing the Sumerians had claimed 5,000 years earlier. They hypothesized that the moon was an artificial planetoid, essentially a massive spaceship hollowed out by a highly advanced intelligence. They argued that it had been deliberately steered into Earth's orbit for unknown observational or interventionist purposes. And they didn't just throw out a wild idea. They systematically laid out massive amounts of physical, observational evidence that standard astronomy has never been able to properly explain. The first piece of major evidence the Soviet scientists pointed out was the bizarre, mathematically impossible nature of lunar craters. The surface of the moon is violently scarred by millions of meteor impacts. Some of these craters are unbelievably massive, stretching for over 150 miles across. By all known laws of physics and hypervelocity impact mechanics, a meteor large enough to gouge out a hole 150 miles wide should easily penetrate miles deep into the surface of the planet. But they don't. The craters on the moon, regardless of how incredibly wide they are all uniformly, bafflingly shallow. A crater 50 miles wide will be violently flat on the bottom, rarely exceeding a depth of 2 to 3 miles. It is mathematically impossible for a natural rock to absorb hypervelocity impacts in this manner. Vasin and Sherbakov proposed a chilling solution. The craters are shallow because the moon is heavily armored. They hypothesized that beneath a relatively thin 2 to 3 mile layer of space dust and pulverized rock, there is a massive, incredibly dense artificial hull, an armor plating designed to protect the hollow interior from cosmic bombardment. When a massive meteor strikes the moon, it effortlessly blows through the soft outer dust layer. But when it hits the dense inner hull, the kinetic energy has nowhere to go but outward, creating massive, shallow, flat-bottomed craters. This leads directly to the second massive anomaly: the chemical composition of the moon itself. When the Apollo astronauts brought hundreds of pounds of lunar rocks back to Earth for intense laboratory analysis, the geochemists were completely baffled. The rocks contained massive, unusually high concentrations of highly specific elements. Specifically, they found astronomical levels of titanium, zirconium, and yttrium. Why is this important? Because these are not standard, everyday rocks. These are highly complex, refractory metals. They are incredibly dense. They possess impossibly high melting points, and they are incredibly resistant to extreme heat, pressure, and anti-corrosion. In the modern industrial world, these are the exact, specific materials that aerospace engineers use to build the hulls of deep-diving nuclear submarines, the heat shields of returning space capsules, and the interior linings of supersonic jet engines. The Soviet scientists pointed out that if you were going to artificially construct a massive armored transport vessel designed to survive the violent, grinding vacuum of deep space for millions of years, this is exactly the metallurgical composition you would use to build the hull. Furthermore, the overall density of the moon makes absolutely no sense. The Earth has a mean density of about 5.5 grams per cubic centimeter. The moon, however, has a mathematically confirmed density of only 3.34 grams per cubic centimeter. It is significantly lighter than it physically should be for a solid object of its massive size. In 1962, Dr. Gordon MacDonald, a leading scientist at NASA, published a study stating that looking at the orbital mechanics and the density parameters, it is more mathematically logical to assume the moon is hollow than it is to assume it is a solid sphere. Dr. Sean C. Solomon of MIT further elaborated on this, writing that the lunar orbiter experiments vastly improved our knowledge of the moon's gravitational field and strongly indicated the frightening possibility that the moon might be hollow. But the physical structure of the moon is only half of the mystery. The other half lies in its incredibly precise, almost terrifyingly perfect orbital mechanics. The moon operates in a way that defies the statistical probabilities of standard planetary physics. Let's look at the most obvious, everyday miracle: the total solar eclipse. When you stand on Earth and watch a total eclipse, the moon perfectly, exactly covers the burning disk of the sun. Not partially, not mostly. Exactly. For this to happen, an impossible mathematical coincidence must exist. The moon is exactly 400 times smaller than the sun, but it is also, exactly, 400 times closer to the Earth than the sun is. The ratios perfectly cancel each other out, creating the exact optical illusion of two identically sized spheres in the sky. The legendary science fiction author and biochemist Isaac Asimov famously wrote about this anomaly. He stated that there is absolutely no astronomical reason why the moon and the sun should fit so perfectly. It is the most unlikely, mathematically absurd coincidence in the known universe. And it is the only place in the entire solar system where this perfect optical eclipse occurs. Then there is the issue of tidal locking. The moon is tidally locked to the Earth, meaning its rotation perfectly, exactly, matches its orbit. Because of this, it only ever shows us one single face. The dark side of the moon is permanently hidden from human eyes on the surface. While tidal locking does happen to other moons in the solar system, it usually takes billions of years to achieve, and the orbits are almost always highly elliptical, shaped like elongated ovals. But our moon's orbit is startlingly, almost perfectly circular. It operates less like a naturally captured asteroid settling into a chaotic gravitational dance, and more like a massive satellite that was precisely, artificially parked into a stable, geostationary orbit. Even the moon's age is completely wrong. Standard astronomy teaches that the moon was created when a Mars-sized object smashed into a young Earth, breaking off a massive chunk of rock that eventually coalesced into the moon. This means the moon should be roughly the same age as the Earth, or slightly younger. But when scientists carbon dated and radioisotope tested the Apollo lunar samples, they found something deeply disturbing. Many of the lunar rocks were significantly older than the oldest known rocks on Earth. Some samples were dated at 4.6 billion years old, older than the accepted age of our entire solar system. How can a chunk of the Earth be billions of years older than the Earth itself? The Soviet scientists Vasin and Shcherbakov had an answer. The moon wasn't born here. It was built somewhere else, in a much older star system, and flown here. For decades, astronomers assured the public that the moon was a completely dead, silent, dry rock. A sterile environment where nothing has happened for billions of years. But modern technology has completely shattered that narrative. In recent years, highly advanced lunar orbiters have detected massive, unexplained plumes of water vapor violently venting from deep within the moon's interior, specifically around the supposedly dead craters. If the moon is a solid, dead rock, where is the massive internal pressure coming from to vent vapor miles into the vacuum of space? Furthermore, amateur and professional astronomers constantly document transient lunar phenomena, or TLPs. These are massive, unexplained flashes of light, strange rolling mists, and bizarre color changes occurring on the lunar surface. Some theorists suggest these are not geological events, but massive outgassings from a deeply buried, decaying artificial atmosphere venting through the cracked outer hull. When you take all of this modern, hard scientific data, the reverberating seismic shockwaves, the shallow, armor-plated craters, the aerospace-grade refractory metals, the impossible density, the mathematically perfect orbital mechanics, and the venting of internal gases, and you lay it directly over the ancient Sumerian cuneiform texts, the result is absolutely chilling. The ancient people of Mesopotamia were not writing fairy tales. They lacked the scientific vocabulary to describe astrophysics, so they used the only words they had. They described a highly advanced, heavily armored transport vessel entering our solar system as a chariot of the gods. They described the apocalyptic gravitational displacement it caused as a great flood. They described the highly advanced beings who navigated this vessel as the Anunnaki. Think about the profound, world-altering implications of this. It means that the object hanging in our night sky, the silver orb that has inspired countless generations, is essentially an ancient, derelict mothership. It is a massive, hollowed-out observational platform sitting completely silent in the dark. We assume it is dead. We assume whoever built it, whoever steered it across the terrifying void of deep space and perfectly parked it 400 times closer than the sun, abandoned it long ago. But the water vapor venting from the deep interior, the strange lights flashing in the dark craters, and the perfect, unyielding stability of its orbit suggests something far more terrifying. Perhaps the ancient Sumerians didn't just document the arrival of this vessel. Perhaps their intense, obsessive worship of the moon was actually a form of deep ancestral trauma, a desperate, continuous plea to the sky, hoping that the massive armored doors hidden beneath the lunar dust never open again. The next time you walk outside on a clear night and look up at the full moon, do not just see a rock. Look at the shallow, violently flat craters. Think about the titanium hull buried just beneath the dust. Think about the hours of continuous ringing echoing through the massive, empty dark inside. The truth of human history and our place in the universe might not be buried in the sands of Earth. It might be orbiting right above our heads, silently watching, exactly where the ancient texts said it would be.